Well, good evening, and welcome to our Friday night Bible study for Friday, September 26, 2025. This will be the last one in September. Yeah, things start happening after September. One thing is, we're very close to the end of the federal year, fiscal year, although I do believe, last I heard, that Congress had managed to work out some sort of a deal to keep government operating. Those of us who live on government benefits are a little more concerned about that than those who only see government as an impedance to the things they want to do. But yeah, so uh, well, I've got a few things to talk about here. After this presentation this evening, this computer is going to get to take a rest, finally. And it's not because what I had planned last week actually worked. It didn't. The part I ordered came in the mail. I put it in, and the computer didn't see it. Well, then I started looking at some things I should have looked at before, and the particular device that I bought was not on my motherboard's compatibility list. So then I got online and started looking for one that was on the compatibility list. I found one half the size, but I'm thinking that may be adequate for what I'm going to do with this computer. It cost a little bit more, but it wasn't going to get here until middle or end of next month. And I really didn't want to wait that long. Now, good news, I was able to return the part that I ordered incorrectly, and they let me print out a label, and I printed the label out, stuck it on the package, put everything back the way it came. I mean, I did have to cut the package open, so there's a few things that won't be pristine, but maybe they can send it back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer can repackage it, and it'll be just fine. I don't know what they do, but they are going to let me return it and give me some money back. So that's a benefit. And I did go into town to the Chamber of Commerce building and drop it off in the UPS drop box there today. So it'll probably take a week to get to them, so it'll be a while before I see the money back. But anyway, life continues, and we just keep plugging on. But I'm thinking, no, I don't really want to have to wait that long and rely on this computer because I'm wearing it out. So I happen to remember I had some old physical mechanical hard drives that had not died that I took out of my computer when I upgraded it to my first solid state drive, which was back, I don't remember, 2018 or even earlier. That was quite a long time ago. And I didn't really need what was on them, so I was able to install it in the computer, delete the partition that was on it, one of them. I picked up the biggest one of the three that I had, and then format a new partition on it, and I was able to install Windows on it. Now, I'm still working on updating. Now, in the past, I had been able to install from my disk and then update to the current version of Windows. This time, it made me go on to the Microsoft website and download some things in order to upgrade my version of Windows. And that's still in the process in the other room. But it is up and running, and I haven't got much installed on it because this is going to be a temporary setup until I get that better solid state drive in and installed and working. I'm kind of going to be careful about how much I try to install on this one because I don't want to put in a lot of work just to have to do it all over again when I get the new drive in. We'll see how much I can transport over. I don't know what Windows will let me do, but we'll worry about that when we get there. So that got done. It was my week to do the lawn, and I ran out of gas in the middle. I had to go to the gas station, buy more gas to finish the lawn. Gave me a bit of a break though, so that worked out, and we got that done. And I just noticed a news story this evening, and I won't be able to get the name right. Over the last 5 or 10 years, courts have been talking about a drug that is more powerful than heroin or morphine. And it was developed originally as a pain-killing medicine. But it was extremely potent, and it is very easy to overdose on it. That's fentanyl. Now, most of the time, judges and prosecutors and defendants and even defense attorneys, all these people will very often say the name incorrectly. They'll say it like it's an alcohol, fentanyl. Well, it's not spelled N-O-L, it's spelled N-Y-L, fentanyl. But there is nitrazine or something like that, and it's about 40 times as potent as fentanyl. And it is showing up in, well, you know, drug dealers don't have the best interests of their clients at heart, and they will sometimes lace the drugs they sell to people with more potent drugs, and if they're not careful about it, they can end up killing their clients. And that has happened. And this new nitrazine, or whatever it is so potent that the Narcan that police carry around to deal with overdoses may not be able to deal with an overdose on this stuff. So this is nasty stuff, and it's out there. The story I read said something about Texas and Tennessee, but the story itself came out of California, where a young man died this week after getting some of that in what he thought was something else. So, yeah. Now, I haven't gotten one of these in several months, I don't think, but I did get a Bible question this week. It showed up while I was doing all this, trying to switch over to a different computer. So I had to do it on this computer, which I usually don't do, but it was what I had available at the moment. So I did it, and I have it here. And we'll read that at this time. I didn't comment on the guy's name. He has given himself the name of a prominent Jew from Jesus' day, Gamaliel. Who made Adam and Eve to eat the apple from the tree that the Lord Jesus Christ said they must not eat it? Well, yeah, okay. Here's the answer I gave. Dear Gamaliel, thank you for visiting our site and for submitting your question about the first human sin. First, let's read the Bible text that narrates the story. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" That's Genesis 3, verse 1. Although a question rather than a statement, there is a lie inherent in what the serpent said. Here's the actual command in question. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." That's Genesis 3, verses 2 and 3. Did the woman add to what God had said, or was the previous quote incomplete? In this version of the story, God issued the command to avoid the tree of knowledge of good and evil before he created the woman. So she may have heard it secondhand. Having his first insinuation about God's evil intent thus thwarted, the serpent changed his tack. "You will not surely die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Genesis 3, 4, and 5. The statement that separation from the Creator, the source of life, would not result in death was a blatant lie. The next statement bore the mark of even greater falsehood. God doesn't have your interests at heart, he implied. He put this restriction on you to keep you subject to his power for his own benefit. But the woman believed these lies and ate the fruit. Note that the text doesn't tell us what kind of fruit. The bit about an apple became part of the story in human retelling much later. We know from other Bible texts that the serpent was actually the devil, Satan. But Satan, the Hebrew means accuser, and here he accuses God, didn't make the first humans eat the fruit. That's a choice they made based on the serpent's misinformation. Interesting note. In the Hebrew, the language God used to state when those who ate the fruit of the forbidden tree would die includes the word yom. That word means day and is used in Genesis 1. Every place it says the evening and the morning were the nth day, or yom in the Hebrew. The fact that Adam and Eve didn't die that day means God had already made a provision of forgiveness and grace. The promise about the seed of the woman asserted that God intended to fix the mess the two made when they believed the serpent's lies. That grace extends to each of us, even today. The choice belongs to us. Will we let God fix us? If we do, we inherit eternal life. May God bless as you continue to seek truth from his word. Sincerely, me and all the titles that I put with it, based on the site that those questions come from. So, probably a lot more could be said, but we are prepared to probably finish the book of Esther this evening. The story of Esther is perhaps the most dramatic story in the Bible in terms of what we humans consider to be high drama. There's intrigue, there's politics, there's double-crossing of sorts, there's surprise twists in this text. Now, this is one of the things that makes the book subject to criticism, because there was a lot of Hebrew literature with somewhat sacred themes to it, and some of these were pretty fantastic, and like the fish that talked while it was in the fire being cooked for dinner. Yeah, that's found, if you aren't aware of it, in the Apocrypha, some of the books that are included in some versions of the Old Testament, but that generally Protestants reject as being valid as scripture. So, to what extent has this book been enhanced and maybe gets a little beyond the actual events described in order to jazz up the story a little bit? You know, people these days try to blame Hollywood for, they take a book and they change it. And they do that with essentially everything. They don't follow the story that the author of the book wrote. They adapt it for the silver screen. And they do that. But let's face it, even when somebody writes a documentary style book, they're going not necessarily play loose with the facts, but they're going to do what they can to make their book more readable. They want to sell the book. So it's not surprising that this would happen. Humans have been doing it for ages and ages. And so There may be a little bit in this book that's been, shall we say, jazzed up to make it more readable, which seems they succeeded. But at any rate, and when we get to different places, I will give you this one example. The book in chapter 3, I believe, relates to the casting of lots, and they call it the P-U-R, or poor. And critics of the book say that wasn't really necessary in the narrative. That was only put in there to explain the name of the feast that resulted from these events. The Feast of Purim. They had the Feast of Passover from when they left Egypt. Then they got the Feast of Purim from this attempt to wipe out the Jews. And then during the days of the Maccabees, when the Greeks were trying to Hellenize the Jews and force their religion on them, there were Jews who were hiding in a cave, and they received miraculous water in the cave, according to the stories that are there. And that led to the Feast of Hanukkah. In our area, the public radio station has fundraisers from time to time, as essentially all public radio stations do. And in our area, there are a couple of gentlemen who show up for every fundraiser to help the station, and they host a segment of the programming, and they call themselves the Two Jewish Guys. And they say a lot about what's Jewish, not Jewish, and these kinds of things. And one of the things that I heard them say, probably more than once, is their take on Jewish feasts. All these feasts, the fundamental idea behind them is they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And definitely the Feast of Purim, based on the stories in this book, fits into that category. They, in this case Haman and his allies, tried to kill the Jews. The Jews survived. Now they have a feast and they eat. So let's bow our heads and we'll get right into this. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the blessings you give to us. We thank you that we have this life and that we have an opportunity to get to know you better and to invite you into our lives, and thus to be transformed into your image, the image in which we were created, to be fixed and repaired and restored to eternal life. We want that. And so as we open the Word, we ask that the Holy Spirit will attend to what is done and said and heard during this session, that each individual might receive the unique blessing they need at this time. And we ask this in Jesus' name. So, let's see if we can switch over our view here and look at chapter 5. We finished chapter 4, where Mordecai went to Esther. Well, he sent messages to her and convinced her ultimately to go to the king to seek redress for the grievance of Haman trying to kill all Jews everywhere within the reach the Medo-Persian Empire, which was essentially everywhere where there were Jews, the Medo-Persian Empire had control. This would have been a pretty effective genocide had Haman been able to get away with it. So Mordecai is telling his cousin, whom he raised as a daughter, who knows but what you ended up Queen of Persia for this very purpose. That's one of the key quotes out of this book. For such a time as this, there was a video made a number of years back in which they dramatized the story of Esther, and that's what they called it, For Such a Time. The other famous quote, also in chapter 4, is when Esther said, well, okay, let's fast for a few days, and after we fast, then I'm going to go to the king, and if I die, I die. So, on the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. That was the indication that it's okay for you to approach the king. This is my indication. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Well, that's probably an overgenerous statement, but it's the kind of thing that people would say. It kind of had become part of the culture, and it would be used here and in other places in the Bible. Hey, I like you. I'll give you whatever you want, up to, well, in our day they'd say up to 49% of my company because I want to retain control. So I need 51% so I have control. If I give you 50%, then we're just fighting. But anyway, he says up to half the kingdom. And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now, tell me what you really want. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Same language again. Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." All right, what's going on here? She risks her life to go see the king. The king accepts her favorably, extends the scepter. She gets in, she gets to talk to him, she invites him to a banquet. They're there at the banquet. Now's the time to talk. No, wait till tomorrow. Let's have another banquet. Okay, maybe it happened this way, but it may be just to make room for the events that are about to take place. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. Many children probably means that while Zeresh was his wife, she wasn't his only consort. Yeah. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Sounds like he doesn't know what this is all about, does he? He has no clue. And he's at home crowing to his wife and his friends about all the honor that's being bestowed upon him. Then he added, "But this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate." So, Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested, "Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall and in the morning asked the king to impale Mordecai on it. Now this is interpreting, because the King James Version says gallows. Let's see what the NIV says. I don't remember it saying anything quite like this. And got to turn pages here. Okay, even the NIV uses the term gallows. However, based on archaeology and knowledge of the practices of the Persians, a sharp pole, impaling someone on a sharp pole, was the general method of execution in those days. So that's what they believe this is all about. And making it that tall, make sure everybody can see how he has dealt with his enemy. And this is done to project fear into the hearts of anybody who might oppose him. So that's what they suggest. And then they say to him, when this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up, apparently right there on his own property. So, by the way, the Hebrew is 50 cubits, or approximately 23 meters. A cubit is generally be about 1.5 feet, 18 inches, approximately. So that's how they get to 75 feet from 50 meters. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, which is not a surprise. His queen had just risked her life to talk to him, had invited him to a banquet, and then at the end of the banquet said, well, come to a banquet tomorrow, I'll tell you what's really going on. And, well, and now you're expected to go home and go to bed and go to sleep and sleep through the night, not knowing what's up. The king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. Now, I don't know if this king could or could not read, but let's face it, he was a king. Why should he read himself, which is going to make it hard for him to go to sleep, if he can have somebody read to him in monotone and, knock him clear off to sleep. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who's that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Now, listen to this narcissist train of thought. Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go. This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Now, imagine, Haman is thinking all these things to himself, and he's saying this to the king, but as he's saying it, he's imagining himself in the king's royal robes, sitting on that horse, being paraded through town with someone shouting out, "This is how we treat the man the king wants to honor." That's the mental image he has. "Excellent," the king said to Haman. "Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested." I wonder if Haman was able to hide his emotions at this point from the king. We're not told in the story. He apparently managed it, or the king would have asked him questions. Either that or the king was so sleepy he wasn't noticing what was going on. I don't know. But certainly this was the worst thing that could have happened to Haman of all the things that happened over the last 2 days. Now he has to take this man he hates, dress him in the king's robe, put him on the king's horse, and he himself will have to strut him through the city proclaiming this is what is done to the man the king desires to honor. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. Now remember, he went to the king early in the morning to incite the king to execute Mordecai on Haman's own sharpened pole, set up in his own property. And instead of securing the man's execution, he is forced to do this and to go through the city shouting this. I mean, everybody knows who they both are. Most of the people who saw this procession probably knew that Mordecai was not showing the honor that Haman had been asked for, and knew that Haman hated Mordecai with all his guts. And now they see this going on, and they're like, okay, what's this all about? And since Haman didn't know why the king wanted to answer this man, he didn't suggest that it be said why the king wanted to answer him. So it's likely that very few people understood that this was being done for Mordecai because of his report that thwarted the attempts of Bigthana and Teresh to assassinate the king. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wife's advisors and his wife said, "Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." Well, there's a 180-degree about face. Just yesterday they told him to erect that gallows or sharpened pole, whatever it was, in order to execute Mordecai. And now they're saying, okay, this is what happened. Well, we can read the tea leaves here. They didn't have to read tea leaves. They didn't have to read chicken livers or whatever people do to foretell the future. It was becoming pretty obvious. Anybody could have come to this conclusion. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. And we don't know if they had any impact on Haman, because not enough time is going to elapse for us to see any change in him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Banquet day 2. End of chapter 6, beginning of chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request," again, same language as before, "I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." Well, nowadays we consider that slavery is worth bothering government about, and government does take action when they find human trafficking taking place. However, this is what she says, and why she throws in this bit about slavery, I don't know, but she's saying, listen, this is a big deal. They want to wipe us out. Somebody has planned genocide on me and my people. Who would do such a thing, King Xerxes demanded. Recall, he doesn't know who Esther is. He doesn't know her nationality. He knows that Haman has asked for permission to annihilate the Jews. But he doesn't know that, so he doesn't know who is threatening his queen and her people. Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. There's a particular judge in Michigan that I watch fairly often, and you can tell when somebody triggers him and he's getting exceptionally angry, because all of a sudden you'll call a recess and get up, leave the bench, and go back behind the door into his office, and he'll go there and take the opportunity to relax and cool down and get over his rage, and then he'll come back out and take the matter up again. Yeah, so that's kind of what Xerxes is doing here, I think. He's gotten so mad that he didn't want anybody to see him in his rage. So he goes out into the palace garden to walk it off and to cool down a little bit before he makes a fool of himself. Wise advice for a lot of people. If you get angry, the best thing to do is to take a break, cool down, because if you act in anger, you're probably going to make a fool out of yourself. The old saying is, better to keep your mouth shut and let everybody think you're stupid than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Speaking when you are in a rage, when you are triggered, when your rational brain has been shut down, it's a very foolish thing to do. And kudos to the people who have made it a point that when they recognize that they've been triggered, they separate themselves from the situation and come back to it once they've cooled down and their rational brain is back in charge. And it can take a little bit. But it's a very wise thing, because it can prevent you from doing something exceptionally foolish. And apparently King Xerxes understood this, so he goes out to the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. Now, we know this about the culture back then, in Jesus' day, among the Romans, but before that as well. And that was that meals were not taken from a seated position like we do in our day, in our culture. Meals were taken in a reclining position. I don't know, suppose some people might make some comments about the health of eating when you're sitting up versus eating when you're reclining. However, if you're reclining, you're close to laying clear down. And now Haman has fallen onto the couch next to Esther, just as the king returns from the palace garden, and any rage that he had allowed to boil off returns immediately. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" Yeah. Some people have suggested, is he going to force himself on my queen? Yeah, that would be a very dangerous thing to do, particularly in the king's presence. I'm sure that's not what Haman had in mind, but that may be, as the king suggests here, what the king interpreted, or at least used that interpretation to justify what he was about to do. I mean, it's bad enough that he wants to kill the queen and all her people. But now he sees this. Well, now that gives him all the justification he needs to execute this man, which is what he's intending to do. And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, we've heard that name before, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Now, a lot of what's going on here does not reflect the character of the Creator. God does not engage in revenge and retaliation and tit for tat, those kinds of things. That's not in the character of love. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13 that love keeps no record of wrongs. God isn't out to get his enemies. He's out to save his enemies. But we understand that this is how people think in our day, and if they think that way in our day, they certainly thought that way back then when human life was cheaper. So, yeah, the king's anger subsided when he saw this man executed. Next chapter. On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. So now Mordecai gets the position as an advisor to the king that Haman had. Kind of turnabout there. And then Esther appoints him to be in charge of Haman's property. The king gave it to her, but she's the queen. She lives in the palace. She doesn't need Haman's estate. So she has Mordecai take charge of it to use and to administrate and so forth. Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Again the king held off the gold scepter to Esther, so she rose and stood before him. Esther said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who ordered that the Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked." This was the policy with the Medes and Persians. We run into the same policy in Daniel chapter 6, I believe. The story of Daniel in the lion's den. The king wanted to save Daniel, but the order had been issued and written, and he couldn't retract it. That was how the Persians did. And we've talked before about why that is. In our country, we observe what we call the rule of law. And the rule of law is put in place in order to prevent the whims of a given head of state from changing the rules we live by, because it makes it hard to plan ahead. You know, if you understand that these procedures will get you a tax break and this spending will cost you taxes, so you plan ahead for what spending you're going to do, and then the law changes next year, and the things you thought would get you a tax break get you taxed, and the things that you thought would get you taxed would get you a tax break. Well, that makes it rough to do business. It makes it rough to make a living, particularly if you're planning to make a profit, which is, you know, income that you don't earn. Somebody else earns it and you get it. So, you know, if you want to do these things, if you want to plan ahead with confidence, if you want to know how you should live, then the law needs to be a stable thing. And for that reason, our courts rely heavily on what we call precedent. So when you go to order your case before the king, you will say, well, in this case, the judge decided this, and in this case, the judge decided this, and in this case, the judge decided this. So you need to do what these other judges have done and decide this case in the way we're asking you to do it. Of course, the other side's going to say the same thing, but the point being that precedent is important because that makes the law more stable, and it makes it possible for people to plan ahead and to figure out how they're going to go about life and not end up on the wrong side of the law. So this, I don't know if it was an invention of the Persians. Let's do something here just for the fun of it. Let's see what it tells us here. No, the Persians did not invent stable laws. The earliest examples of recorded legal systems come from much older Mesopotamian civilizations, such as the Sumerians and the Babylonians. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which arose much later, built upon these existing legal traditions, and they give examples of older legal codes. However, it seems to me, and I might be wrong, that this idea that the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed was an invention of them, or at least it was made more prominent with them. So anyway, maybe I asked the question wrong. So So that's now going to be a problem because Haman has gotten this decree written out and it's been signed with the king's signet ring. And by the laws and procedures and culture of the Persians, this law can't be repealed. You can't say, okay, no, you don't go out and kill the Jews. So now you've got to be creative to figure out how to deal with the existing law and to counteract it without repealing it. So here's what they do. So on June 25, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors and the nobles of all the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Or we say Ethiopia, they're going to say Cush. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. The king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. The day chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes was March 7 of the next year. So they've got nearly a year for this information to get out and to be worked with. Now, we've passed up 3 footnotes there. Hebrew on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. This day was June 25, 474 BC. See also the note on chapter 2, verse 16, which we read last week. Hebrew does say to Cush. And then for C, the Hebrew, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. The date selected was March 7, 473 BC. See also the note on 216. So again, we can align the dates of the Hebrew calendar to the Persian calendar, and from the Persian calendar then relate these dates directly to our modern calendars. And those dates are going to be, we're going to imagine projecting the, what we call the, I can't come up with a name for it right now. The calendar we use right now is named after a pope. I can't think of the name we use for it, but it's going to project that calendar backwards in time, even though that calendar was not used. Gregory, Pope Gregory, so it's the Gregorian calendar. It's based on the Roman calendar, but it makes certain specific changes. And Pope Gregory's scholars and mathematicians and so forth did a very good job of adapting the calendar to be accurate to the seasons over a very long period of time. And so you can take those principles and project the calendar backwards to cover dates before the calendar was adopted. And that's what they're doing here to give these dates. So, we've read verses 11 and 12 there, and the plan of this decree is to say, well, we're not rescinding the earlier decree, but we are saying that the Jews have the right to defend themselves and to annihilate anybody who attacks them, and if they annihilate them, then they get to take their property, in which case it might make people think twice about fulfilling Haman's desire to go out and kill Jews if they're defended, and if they manage to attack you, they get your property. Yeah, there's an incentive there, a definite incentive. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that the Jews would be ready to take revenge on their enemies on the appointed day. So, urged on by the king's command, the messengers rode out swiftly on fast horses bred for the king's service. The same decree was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing the royal robe of blue and white, the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. And that's the end of Esther chapter 8. There are 2 more chapters in the book, but I want to do something here, and I've closed everything on this computer. So if you'll give me a moment to minimize things here, I want to search for something, and so I'm bringing up Google Earth. It's wanting to come up over here on that other monitor, but once it comes up, I can bring it back over here where we can see it. It's taking its time opening. Frequently does, because it has to download data from Google servers. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get this over here where we can see it. There we go. And there is, we're sort of centered on Iran here. There's Tehran, and let's swing that around so that north is up, as we're used to. And let's see, that's, I believe, the Caspian Sea there. And it comes down to within, 100 miles or so of Tehran. People in Tehran like to party and holiday up on the Black Sea. So there are resorts along there for the people of Tehran. There's Tehran where you almost can't see that because my thing's in the way. Let's do this. Let's use this version. That way you can see this a little better. I'm going to see if I can find it this way. Well, that's not how you spell it. Okay. That's not coming up with what I want. That's interesting. We're getting things in, I'm thinking some of these are in the United States. Well, I thought I had run across the tomb of Queen Esther in a Persian or Iranian city at some point. And I found that when I was, this would have been last Christmas, when I was researching the information in the novel The Other Wise Man, which we read on Christmas Eve last year on this group. And I thought I'd run across it, but it's not bringing it up for me here. Okay, it might be. Okay, yeah. So, I know it's hard for you to see this because the type is not very big, but this is the Iranian city of Hamadan, and this has just pointed out to us here the tomb of Esther and Mordecai. I spell it a little bit different. And that'll probably bring us up a picture of the building. It's called Historical Place Museum, Ancient Museum, thought to contain the bodies of biblical Queen Esther and her cousin Mordecai, and they spelled it there like we do in normal English. So I thought I might be able to find that. I just had to type it right. So let's go back to this screen and let's get our Bible text back up. And let's move on to chapter 9. So on March 7, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them, but no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And this might be the wisdom of Mordecai's decree. By pitting forces against each other, he was able to avoid violence and bloodshed altogether. At least that's what I'm reading here. Nobody tried. They were all afraid. And so the Jews didn't have to retaliate. The law didn't give them that permission. They were only given permission to retaliate if people attacked them. So if they didn't attack, then they were safe from the Jews, and the Jews were equally safe from them. So yeah, I think that's the wisdom of Mordecai, and that may be why even today the people of Persia, we call it Iran today, honor Esther and Mordecai, because even though they were Jews, they served the people of their kingdom honorably and with wisdom. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. Okay, so I was wrong. There was some violence here. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. The law allowed it, but they didn't do it, whatever the point of that is. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He called for Queen Esther. He said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they've done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want to be granted to you? Tell me and I will do it. Esther responded, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do again tomorrow as they have done today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8 and killed 300 more men, and again they took no plunder. So, yeah, like we say, people are not reflecting the character of the Creator. They're doing what they think is necessary to protect themselves, and, you know, people are still doing that today. I can do this because I'm protecting myself. And, you know, legally, if you're in fear for your life, particularly if you're a police officer, you are allowed to use deadly force and not be held accountable for it because you did what you had to protect yourself. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend themselves. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not take any plunder. This was done throughout the provinces on March 7, and on March 8 they rested, celebrating their victory with a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7, and again on March 9, then rested on, March 8, then rested on March 9, making that their day of feasting and gladness. So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. Again, they tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. Well, yeah, the lot is pure, so the lots would be Purim, because in Hebrew you add im to the end of the word to form the plural. So more than one lot would be Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. Now, based on what we've read, this predates a little bit the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And yet Ezra and Nehemiah are carrying on about the purity of the holy race. But right here, they're letting people who desire to join them and become Jews with them. Mm-hmm. These days will be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. Now, I wonder, because we're talking about Jews in 127 provinces, they had been scattered. Now, part of that was what Nebuchadnezzar did to Babylon, but I wonder if at this point this is also including the members of the 10 tribes. They weren't Jews per se, but they were Israelites, and they observed supposedly the same religion. It's possible. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time, decreed by both Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther, the Jew. I don't know why they say it just for him. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was all written down in the records. And all that's about dates and how they come up with the dates and how this version chose to translate the dates. Chapter 10, I believe, is very short. It talks about the greatness of Xerxes and Mordecai. King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. Short chapter, 3 verses, not a lot to say other than, hey, Mordecai became well respected. Yeah, okay. And that concludes the book. Now, just for the fun of it, The Persian king mentioned in the book of Esther is Ahasuerus, who is widely identified by biblical scholars as Xerxes I, 486 to 465 BCE. The name Ahasuerus is the Hebrew version of Xerxes' name, which also appears in the context of the Achaemenid Empire and the Jewish exiles in Persia. And there's a Wikipedia article there. Is Mordecai mentioned in secular history? No, Mordecai is not mentioned directly by name in secular historical records, though some scholars suggest the Persian official Marduk, mentioned in the Persepolis administrative archives and other Persian texts, could be the figure on whom the biblical character is based. While the book of Esther refers to the existence of the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia, which supposedly detailed Mordecai's deeds, this document itself has not been found in secular history. Evidence for a possible historical basis. The biblical name Mordecai is considered a variant of the name Marduk. 30 texts from the periods of Xerxes I mention officials with the names Marduka or Marduku, such as the one found in the Persepolis Administrative Archives. The Greek historian Ctesias, I won't try to say that, also identified a minister of Xerxes named Metakas, who may be this same figure. While evidence suggests a possible connection, the identification of the biblical Mordecai with the secular Marduk is not definitively proven, as no secular source directly names the biblical character. The book of Esther itself claims that the events of Mordecai's life were recorded in the official Persian chronicles. However, these chronicles have not been discovered, making it impossible to find Mordecai's name within them. Historicity debate. Some scholars view the story of Esther as a historical novella with a possible kernel of truth rather than as a fully factual account, questioning the historicity of the specific events and characters. So, yeah, not everybody agrees that it's 100% true, and I don't think I'm going to offer an opinion on it. I think the point of this is, as some people suggest, to demonstrate that God is active in history. He doesn't control things, but he's active in history in order to bring about his purposes. And his purpose was to bring Jesus Christ to this earth in the body of a Jew. Something he couldn't do if the Jews got wiped out by Haman. So he puts people in place and influences them and enables them to defend themselves so that Jesus Christ can come and provide the salvation, the repair of the human race that God intended. And so to that extent then, we do see the character of the Creator displayed in the book of Esther. Now, we're a little bit short, and I don't want to start another book right now, particularly one of this import, but we might spend a little bit of time talking about it. And that's, the next book is obviously the book of Job. We've just turned to it here. Job is considered one of the books of the writings. It's not, specifically speaking, a historical book. And what evidence we have suggests that its place in history is sometime during the Hebrew sojourn in Egypt. That's the best information we can get about it, is that that's when these events took place. And again, I suppose some people could question the historicity of the book and say, well, it's just a book to tell us a story and to give us the sayings of these men. But then there's the wrap story with the prologue here in chapters 1 and 2, and then with the epilogue at the end in chapter, I think it's chapter 40, is it? Where can I see a list of chapters? Well, I know, I'll just look in a paper Bible, that'll tell me. There are 42 chapters, and the epilogue is the last part of chapter 42. And in that epilogue, in that last part, God says that Job spoke what was right, but that his friends did not. So we have a lot of poetic verbiage in this book that God says isn't accurate. And the weird thing is, as we read through it, we'll find out that sometimes Job himself will say some of the same kinds of things as his friends were saying. It may be just because those ideas were so much a part of the culture that they had affected even Job himself. Now, we have talked in the past about the idea that prior to the Babylonian captivity, few Jews understood the concept of an enemy of God, of an accuser, of a devil, as we sometimes call him. That is hinted at in passages in both Isaiah and Ezekiel, but those, you have to read those as symbolic language because they directly speak of human institutions and persons. The language, though, does seem to suggest the interpretation that's usually put on those passages. But then that person is also mentioned here. Satan is mentioned here. But remember, Satan is Hebrew for accuser. So, in this story, as the Jews would have read it prior to the Babylonian captivity, God had a big conference in heaven and an accuser showed up and he started accusing Job. Well, okay, it makes for an interesting story. But does this book give us an opportunity to examine the character of the Creator? Because as I've said, sometimes even Job says things about God that we believe don't accurately reflect his character. Well, if this happened before the Jews fled Egypt, and much of the Old Testament, as we've read so far, is written during that time period after the time of this story, and the Jews had some pretty gross misconceptions about God. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised to find them here. But there is a kind of a basic and fundamental principle behind the book of Job that allows us to understand what God is and isn't about, and what role he does and does not take in human history. And this is essentially a 42-chapter poetic discussion of that issue from several sides, from many viewpoints. Now, we have in the past, and it's not a fully developed presentation, but a long time ago we did a sermon presentation when we talked about reality-denying strategies revealed here in the book of Job. And we sampled some of the words of Job's friends and looked at how they illustrated tactics that people used then and continue to use in our day in order to deny reality and to continue spouting their lies and support them and get people to believe them. So there is that aspect of it, and we'll talk about that then next week as we get into this book. And I see we're still a little short, but I think based on the fact that we're at a book break and this is a big deal and I want to get into it. It'll probably take 3 or 4 weeks to get through it. We'll hold off on doing that until next week. And so, until next week, that will be what? October 3rd, I believe. Friday, October 3. Until then, we say goodbye and God bless.